The flood descended upon Ghost Hollow. Like the black water rose in a sudden surge, and the timbers groaned its thunderous roar, drowning out the screams of those caught in its merciless path. Water the color of dried blood churned through Main Street, with the force of a living beast carrying fragments of lives, a child's wooden horse, a woman's Sunday bonnet, the shattered sign from Murphy's Saloon, all swept away in the torrent that devoured everything man had dared to build in this forsaken corner of the Arizona Territory. The air reeked of destruction, wet earth mixed with the metallic tang of blood, the acrid smoke of scattered cooking fires, and something else, the smell of fear, itself sharp and bitter as copper pennies on the tongue. Adobe walls dissolved like sugar lumps in rain, while timber buildings groaned their death songs before surrendering to waters that rose faster than a man could run. Dakota pressed himself flat against his bay mare's neck, feeling her heart hammering beneath his chest like war drums echoing through canyon walls. The warrior they called Silent Rain had earned his name through 15 years of moving through the high desert like morning mist, but today the earth itself screamed louder than any battle cry he'd ever heard. "Nantan, little brother, do you see what the white man's greed has wrought?" The thought came unbidden, accompanied by a memory so vivid it made his chest tighten with old grief. He could see his younger brother's face as clearly as if Nantan stood before him. Those dark eyes bright with laughter as they'd raced their ponies across the red mesas of their childhood, before the cavalry came, before the bounty hunters, before everything turned to blood and sorrow. "Brother, teach me to track the elk." Nantan's voice whispered in his memory, 16 years old, and eager to prove himself a man. "I want to hunt beside you when the snows come." But there had been no elk hunts, no winter stories shared around the fire. Only that terrible canyon wound festering for days, while Dakota hesitated, hoping against hope that the leg could be saved. Only his brother's screams, echoing off stone walls as poison coursed through young veins, only the weight of a lifeless body growing cold in his arms, while stars watched with indifferent eyes. "I should have cut sooner." Dakota whispered to the storm, the words torn away by wind that cared nothing for regret. "Should have chosen your life over your leg, brother. Forgive me." Through the driving rain that lashed like leather whips across his face, his trained eyes caught movement downstream. Something pale struggled against the muddy torrent, half submerged beneath the twisted wreckage of an overturned freight wagon. Lightning split the gray sky like the god's own blade, illuminating the scene in stark, terrible detail. A woman with dark hair plastered to her skull fought against the current, her face gray with pain and exhaustion. The iron teeth of a bear trap had clamped around her right leg just below the knee, its rusted jaws locked tight as death's own grip. Blood seeped between the metal teeth, staining the floodwater crimson where it pooled around her trapped limb. In her white-knuckled fist, she clutched an ivory sewing awl, the kind French seamstresses used for the finest work. Its point gleamed with her own blood, where she'd tried desperately to work the trap's mechanism, each attempt weak with growing desperation. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that spoke of shock and fever building in her slender frame. When she turned her head toward him, eyes that might have been green in better light held the resigned acceptance of prey that knows the hunt has ended. Those eyes reminded him achingly of another pair, younger, darker, filled with the same terrible knowledge that death had come calling. "Please." She whispered the word, barely audible, above the water's roar that sounded like 1,000 Apache war cries rolled into one. "Make it swift." Dakota's hand moved to the obsidian knife at his belt, its black blade still slick with the desert toxin he'd harvested from barrel cactus spines that morning. The poison worked fast, first numbing pain, then stopping breath altogether. His grandfather had taught him the preparation during those long-ago summers when the world still made sense, when Apache lands stretched endless and free beneath boundless skies. Remember, grandson. The old man's voice echoed across the years. Sometimes mercy wears the face of death. A warrior must know when to grant the final kindness. But as his fingers closed around the knife's grip, the distant sound of horses reached his ears through the storm's fury. Voices carried on the wind, hard voices belonging to men who made their living from other people's misery. Voices he recognized with the clarity of lightning, illuminating familiar landmarks. Tracks washed out past Miller's Creek. One called his words sharp with frustration. But I saw unshod hoofprints heading toward the willows. "That Apache's worth 200 in territorial scrip," came the reply, delivered in gravelly tones that made Dakota's jaw clench with remembrance. "And Clegg's paying another 50 if we bring back his seamstress with breath still in her body." Caleb Stroud. The name alone was enough to set every muscle in Dakota's body coiling like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. At 40 years old, the former Union Scout had spent the last decade perfecting the art of hunting human beings for profit. His reputation for bringing in wanted men, preferably dead, since corpses couldn't argue about bounty amounts or swear vengeance, had made him both wealthy and feared across 3 territories. The woman's fever-bright eyes widened as she heard the approaching riders, and something in her expression shifted from resignation to defiance. "They're coming for you." She breathed each word requiring tremendous effort. "Go. Leave me to die clean rather than in chains." Dakota drew the obsidian blade, watching its surface reflect the storm-dark sky like black water in a sacred pool. The toxin on its edge promised the swift end she'd begged for, the merciful death his grandfather had taught him to grant when all other options had been exhausted. One quick thrust between the ribs, and she would drift away painlessly while he escaped into the canyon country where white men's horses foundered and their courage failed. The knife trembled in his grip as memory and duty warred within him like opposing winds in a desert storm. His brother's voice seemed to whisper through the rain, speaking words in Apache that only blood could truly understand. "Avenge me, brother. Let no death go unpunished. Let no kindness go unrewarded." But as he raised the blade, the woman did something that stopped him as surely as if she'd placed her hand over his heart. With tremendous effort that spoke of will stronger than pain, she lifted her bloodied awl and placed it in his free hand. Her fingers, pale and trembling with shock, wrapped around his darker ones with surprising strength. "Help me cut the hinge first," she said, her voice steady despite the agony etched in every line of her face. "If you're going to end this, at least free me from this cursed trap. Let me die unbound." The simple courage in those words hit him like a physical blow that drove the breath from his lungs. This wasn't merely resignation to fate. This was defiance wrapped in acceptance. The refusal to die as helpless prey even when death seemed inevitable. In that moment, looking into eyes that held no pleading, no self-pity, only a determination to face whatever came with dignity intact, Dakota made a choice that would change the course of both their lives. He sheathed the poisoned knife, working quickly with hands that had learned precision through years of crafting arrows and tracking wounded game through unforgiving terrain. He used her awl to pry at the trap's rusted mechanism. The woman bit down on her lower lip, hard enough to draw blood, but she made no sound as he worked. The iron teeth had bitten deep, crushing bone and muscle with the efficiency of a predator's jaws. But the ancient hinge finally surrendered with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. Fresh blood welled as the pressure released, and she went limp against the muddy bank like a discarded doll. But her eyes remained fixed on his face, studying him with an intensity that spoke of intelligence sharp as winter wind and twice as cutting. "Why?" she gasped as he lifted her in his arms, marveling at how light she'd become from blood loss and shock. You could have granted me peace and escaped clean. Dakota settled her across his mare's withers with the careful gentleness he might use to handle a wounded eagle, then swung up behind her. One arm circled her waist to hold her steady, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse against his forearm like a caged bird's frantic heartbeat. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder with each passing moment, and through the rain, he could see riders emerging from the flooded streets, 5 men with rifles and rope, led by Stroud's distinctive black coat, and the hatred that seemed to radiate from him, like heat from a forge. Because, Dakota said, turning his horse toward the high ground above town, where the old Apache knew paths that cavalry horses had never found, my brother died from a wound like yours, when I waited too long to make the hard choice. I swore before his grave that I would never let hesitation cause death again. As they rode hard through sheets of rain that stung like thrown gravel, the woman's head fell back against his shoulder. Her breathing was growing shallow, and he could feel fever building in her slender frame, like coals banked for a long winter's burning. "What's your name?" She whispered her words, growing fainter with each syllable. "Dakota. The Apache call me Silent Rain. I'm Sylvia Marceline." She murmured, her accent carrying traces of something foreign French perhaps, or the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned English as a second tongue. "And I think I'm still going to die before sunrise." "Not today," he replied with quiet certainty that came from depths he hadn't known he possessed, spurring the bay faster as the first bullets began to sing through the air behind them like deadly hornets. "Not if there's breath left in my body to prevent it." The storm had gentled to a steady downpour by the time Dakota found shelter beneath a massive cottonwood, whose gnarled trunk could stop rifle bullets and whose spreading branches offered blessed protection from the elements. Ancient and storm-scarred, the tree had weathered 100 such tempests and stood ready to weather 100 more, its roots drinking deep from earth that had seen countless struggles between life and death. In the gray light filtering through the rain-heavy canopy, he could see how profoundly the ordeal had marked her. What might once have been a beautiful face, high cheekbones suggesting French ancestry, a mouth made for both laughter and determination, was now drawn tight with suffering, her dark hair hanging in wet tangles around shoulders that shook with more than cold. The crushed leg hung at an unnatural angle, already beginning to swell as infection crept through torn flesh like poison through a stream. He'd seen wounds like this before in battle and hunting accidents in the brutal arithmetic of frontier life, where a moment's carelessness could mean death or dismemberment. "Let me see the damage," he said, kneeling beside her in the mud that squelched beneath his knees. Sylvia nodded, then surprised him by reaching into her bodice to withdraw a small leather roll. Her fingers, though trembling with pain and blood loss, unwrapped it with practiced efficiency to reveal an array of surgical instruments that gleamed like silver prayers in the dim light. A bone saw with teeth sharp as winter-curved needles that caught what illumination existed, silk thread wound on tiny spools, and small glass bottles filled with tinctures that promised healing or death depending on their application. "You're far more than just a seamstress," Dakota observed, studying the professional quality of her tools with growing respect. A ghost of a smile touched her pale lips, and the first sign of life he'd seen in her face since freeing her from the trap. "My father was a ship's surgeon on the French coast before the consumption finally claimed him. I learned at his side from the time I could hold a needle steady without trembling." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of her past, as if the memories themselves provided a source of strength that transcended physical weakness. "After Papa died, there was nothing left for me in Normandy except debts and the kind of marriage arrangements that would have destroyed my soul. So I took passage to New Orleans, then made my way west with a wagon train of families seeking new lives." She paused, gathering thoughts. like a woman preparing to make a confession that might damn her soul or save it. When I reached this territory, I spent 2 years at the Mexican Mission Infirmary near Tucson. The friars there taught me to clean wounds, properly stitch flesh back together, and her eyes met his directly unflinching. When to cut away what cannot be saved to preserve what can be. Dakota examined the mangled leg with gentle but thorough hands, his touch clinical yet careful. The Apache had taught him to read wounds, like white men read newspapers, every tear in flesh, every angle of broken bone, every degree of swelling, told its own story of damage and prognosis. Bones ground together beneath his probing fingers, with the sound of stones shifting in a riverbed, and the heat of infection was already building in the swollen tissue like coals banked beneath ashes. The memory of Nantan's final days rose unbidden. His younger brother's fevered ravings, the stench of corruption, that no amount of sage burning could cleanse the terrible moment when Dakota had finally accepted that no amount of hope could save a limb already claimed by rot. But by then, it had been too late. The poison had spread too far through blood and bone, and Nantan had died in agony while his older brother held him helpless in his arms, listening to final words that would haunt him through 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination. "Brother, why did you wait so long? The leg was already lost 3 days ago. If we keep the leg, the fever kills you," Dakota said quietly, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned knowledge purchased with his brother's life. The bone is shattered beyond any hope of repair, and corruption has already begun its work. Sylvia studied his face, reading the certainty there with eyes that missed nothing and forgave everything. She saw the grief he carried, the guilt that had shaped 15 years of choices, the oath that had driven him to save her when logic demanded he save himself. "You know this for absolute fact," she said, not a question, but a recognition of truth spoken by someone who'd learned to distinguish between hope and delusion. He nodded, unable to keep the grief from his voice. "I know, because I learned too late what happens when you choose hope over reality. My brother died because I waited, because I couldn't accept what needed to be done." She was quiet for a long moment, listening to raindrops patter on the cottonwood leaves above them, like tears falling on a fresh grave. When she spoke again, her voice held the same calm courage she'd shown in the trap, the same refusal to surrender to circumstances beyond her control. "Then we need supplies and a clean table for the work. And we need them before those men find us and make the choice for us." Thunder rolled across the sky like the drums of warring gods as Dakota helped her back onto his mare, noting how she favored her good leg without complaint or self-pity. They rode carefully along game trails that avoided the flooded main road, passing landmarks he'd memorized during months of scouting the territory for routes that cavalry patrols hadn't discovered. A broken windmill stood like a scarecrow against the gray sky, its blades turning slowly in the wind with the sound of old bones creaking. A stand of Spanish oak whispered secrets in a language older than human memory, their leaves dancing with rain that had been falling since the world was young. The charred ruins of a homestead, claimed by Apache raids in years before his time, offered mute testimony to the endless cycle of violence that had claimed this land for generations. The schoolhouse sat on a slight rise above the chaos, its weathered boards dark with rain, but still solid as the New England craftsmanship that had built it from timber that had never known the desert sun. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line that spoke of warmth and safety. And through the rain-streaked windows, Dakota could see figures moving inside like shadows in a lantern show. Ruth Calder stood in the doorway, like a general surveying a battlefield, her steel-rimmed spectacles glinting as she supervised the evacuation of her students to the building's upper loft. At 45, the schoolteacher was a spinster by choice, rather than circumstance, a woman who'd come west because eastern cities had no room for unmarried females with strong opinions and backbones to match. Years of managing unruly frontier children had given her a practical toughness that showed in every line of her angular frame. She'd broken up fights between boys twice her size, faced down drunken fathers who objected to their children learning to read, and once stared down a cougar that had wandered into her classroom during a particularly harsh winter. When she saw Sylvia's pale face and the blood seeping through improvised bandages, Ruth didn't waste time with unnecessary questions or feminine vapors. "I'll bring clean cloth," she called, already moving toward her supply closet with the brisk efficiency that made her classroom run like clockwork. "And whiskey, if we have any left from the last church social." "We need a doctor." Dakota replied, his words carrying across the space between them with quiet urgency. "Doc Boone's clinic is half flooded, but he's there," Ruth said, emerging with an armload of supplies that included sheets, towels, and a bottle that promised relief from pain. "Been ferrying folks across the creek in old Ned Halper's skiff all morning, bless his stubborn hide." They found Dr. Elias Boone exactly where Ruth had said, knee-deep in muddy water that swirled around his legs like liquid earth. The 60-year-old physician resembled a biblical patriarch with his silver beard and piercing blue eyes, but his hands remained steady and his voice calm despite the chaos swirling around him like a living storm. He was helping load an injured miner into a leaky boat that looked older than statehood itself, his movements economical and sure despite the treacherous footing. The miner's leg bent at an angle that nature had never intended, but Boone's touch was gentle as he positioned the man for transport. "Easy there, Miguel," the doctor murmured in Spanish-accented English that spoke of years treating men of all nations. "We'll have you fixed up proper once we reach dry ground." Ned Halper worked the oars with the grim determination of a man whose crops had been washed away, along with everything else he owned in this unforgiving world. The weather-beaten farmer looked up as they approached, taking in their desperate situation with eyes that had seen too much hardship to be surprised by more. "Doc," Ned called, his voice hoarse from shouting orders all morning. "Got another one needs seeing to, and she looks in bad shape." Boone looked up from his patient, and his expression grew grave as he saw Sylvia's condition. 40 years of frontier medicine had taught him to read the signs of mortal injury, and what he saw in her face spoke of time running short. "Bring her inside," he ordered without hesitation, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Ned, make another run to the church. Tell Father Miguel we need all the clean linen he can spare, and quickly." "Yes, sir, Doc," Ned replied, already pushing off from the clinic steps with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his life on water. "Be right back with whatever I can find." Inside the clinic, flood water had reached the baseboards, but hadn't yet damaged Boone's precious instruments, which gleamed in their sterilized case like tools of salvation, blessed by angels of mercy. The doctor cleared his examination table with efficient movements, sweeping aside ledgers and medicine bottles to make space for what he could already see would be desperate work requiring all his skill. "You brought your own supplies," he noted with professional appreciation, observing Sylvia's surgical roll with the eye of a man who recognized quality craftsmanship. "Good. We'll need everything we can get our hands on, and then some besides." Dakota positioned himself near the shuttered window, every sense alert for sounds of pursuit that would herald another kind of death entirely. Outside, he could hear horses splashing through the flooded streets, and occasionally a shout would carry on the wind. Stroud's men still hunting with the persistence of wolves following a blood trail through snow. Dr. Boone examined the crushed leg with the same thoroughness Dakota had shown, but with the additional wisdom of a man who'd spent 4 decades treating the victims of mining accidents, gunshot wounds, and the thousand small tragedies that claimed lives on an unforgiving frontier where death was always just one mistake away. His weathered fingers probed the damage with gentle precision, reading the story written in torn flesh and shattered bone. When he looked up, his blue eyes held no false hope, no comforting lies that would ease the moment at the cost of truth. "We cut now, or she won't see another sunrise," he concluded grimly, his words carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The bone is splintered beyond any hope of repair, and corruption is already spreading through the tissue like wildfire through dry grass." Sylvia gripped Dakota's hand as Boone prepared his instruments with the methodical care of a priest, preparing for Mass, each tool placed precisely where it would be needed in the ritual of healing that required destruction before reconstruction could begin. Her fingers, though weakened by blood loss, held surprising strength of the grip of someone who'd learned to endure pain without surrendering to it, who'd found reserves of courage in places where others found only despair. "Do it with me," she said, her voice soft but steady as mountain stone. "If you know the procedure, I want your hands helping to save what's left of my life." It was an extraordinary request, to ask an Apache warrior to assist in surgery on her own body, to trust her life to hands that had dealt death more often than healing. But faith burned in her fever-bright eyes, and something else that Dakota couldn't quite name, but recognized in his bones. Trust, perhaps, in the skill that had allowed him to free her from the trap, without severing the major arteries that would have meant instant death. The amputation bandages were boiled before use. A carbolic wash stung the wound, and the new wooden leg, with a willow wood socket and leather straps, used a willow wood socket with leather straps and a hand-whittled peg. That followed was brutal in its necessity, and tender in its execution, a dance between violence and mercy that required both strength and delicacy in equal measure. Boone applied the tourniquet with practiced efficiency, while Dakota positioned the bone saw, and Ruth held Sylvia's shoulders steady as she bit down on a leather strap that muffled her cries of agony. The sound of steel cutting through bone echoed in the small room, like a bell tolling for the dead, mixing with the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the harsh rasp of labored breathing. Outside, lightning crashed like warring gods, mirroring the storm raging in their hearts as they fought to save what could be saved and release what was already lost. But it was also gentle in its own way, a healing violence performed with reverence for the life it sought to preserve. Dakota's hands moved with the same careful precision he used to craft hunting arrows or track wounded deer through canyon country, deadly skills transformed to merciful purpose by necessity and choice. When the damaged limb finally came away, he immediately began stitching the flap of skin that would cover the stump, his fingers working in perfect coordination with Boone's whispered instructions. The silk thread pulled flesh together like prayers binding wounds, each stitch a small victory against the forces that sought to claim another life before its time. "Draw the edges together just so," the doctor murmured, guiding Dakota's hands with the patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. "Not too tight, or the skin will tear. Not too loose, or infection will find its way in." "Like this?" Dakota asked, pulling the thread with delicate care that seemed impossible for hands his size. "Exactly like that." Boone confirmed, admiration creeping into his voice despite the gravity of their situation. "By thunder, you have a surgeon's instincts, son. Ever considered taking up the healing arts professionally?" As Dakota worked, his thumb brushed against Sylvia's wrist, where he steadied her arm, and despite the laudanum Boone had given her, she was watching him with eyes that seemed to look straight through to his soul. She studied his face with the same intensity he'd used to examine her wounded leg, reading him like a scout reads sign on a difficult trail. Their gazes locked and held across the surgical field, and something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than circumstance or survival instinct. In that moment, surrounded by the tools of healing and the necessity of pain, when they saw each other with startling clarity that transcended the differences of race and culture that might have divided them in another time, another place. "There," Boone said, as the final stitch was tied with a surgeon's precise knot. "Clean work that would do credit to any medical college back east. She'll live to walk again, though it'll be on one leg and whatever substitute we can craft for the other." Before anyone could respond to this qualified victory, the clinic door exploded inward under the impact of a rifle butt wielded with vicious intent. Stroud's men poured into the room like floodwater, breaching a dam, their weapons drawn, and murder gleaming in their eyes like reflected blade steel. "Well, well," Stroud drawled, pushing past his subordinates to survey the scene with cold satisfaction that spoke of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey after a long and frustrating chase. "The noble Apache and his pet seamstress. Horace Clegg will be mighty pleased to get his property back intact." Caleb Stroud cut an imposing figure, even soaked with rain, and splattered with mud that spoke of hard riding through impossible terrain. His black coat hung open to reveal the matched Colt revolvers at his hips, and his pale eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from years of reducing human beings to bounty prices and profit margins. A livid scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a Comanche lance that had nearly ended his career before it truly began. But the wound had only made him more dangerous, more willing to shoot first and verify identities later, when the territorial government paid good money for Apache scalps and didn't ask too many questions about how they'd been obtained. Dakota moved without conscious thought, overturning the surgical table to create a barrier, as the first bounty hunter raised his rifle with the mechanical precision of a man who'd killed more often than he'd shown mercy. Instruments and medicine bottles crashed to the floor in a symphony of breaking glass, their precious contents spreading across the wet boards like spilled blood that caught the lantern light and threw it back in fractured patterns. Grabbing a bottle of grain alcohol from Boone's supplies, Dakota hurled it at the nearest lantern with deadly accuracy, born of years throwing knives and tomahawks at targets, both stationary and moving. Fire bloomed across the flooded floorboards as the spirits ignited, sending men scrambling backward and filling the room with acrid smoke that stung eyes and throat like punishment for their sins. Ruth Calder, drawing on years of breaking up schoolyard fights and facing down unruly parents who thought education was less important than field work, snatched up Boone's Spencer carbine with the mechanical efficiency of someone long accustomed to taking decisive action when circumstances demanded immediate response. "Back off, you mangy dogs," she shouted, firing a shot that shattered the window frame mere inches above Stroud's head and sent glass fragments raining down like crystalline tears. The former schoolmarm might not have been trained in marksmanship, but she understood the psychology of intimidation better than most soldiers who'd seen actual combat. "Next one goes right through your empty skull." Boone was already dragging Sylvia's makeshift stretcher toward the rear exit, his medical bag clutched in one hand while he pulled with the other. 40 years of frontier medicine had taught him when to fight and when to run, and this was definitely a time for strategic withdrawal. "This way," he called through the smoke and chaos that filled the room like fog. "The back alley leads to higher ground, where we might find better defensive positions." Dakota traded shots with Stroud down the narrow hallway, feeling a bullet graze his bicep and send hot blood running down his arm like liquid fire. The pain was sharp, but manageable. He'd endured worse in battles against cavalry patrols and rival tribes who disputed Apache hunting grounds with rifles and fury. Without conscious thought, he positioned himself between the bounty hunters and Sylvia's stretcher, using his body as a shield while they fought their way toward the promise of open air and freedom. The act was instinctive, born of something deeper than strategy or calculated heroism. "You can't run forever, Apache." Stroud called after them, his voice harsh with fury and frustration. that spoke of a man unaccustomed to being denied his quarry. I know this territory better than you know your own shadow. There's nowhere you can hide that I won't find you eventually. The smoke and rising floodwater finally drove the bounty hunters back, but Dakota knew it was only a temporary reprieve purchased with desperate measures. As they emerged into the gray afternoon that pressed down on them like a wet blanket, he could already hear horses being repositioned to cut off their escape routes. Stroud was nothing if not thorough in his methods, and he'd been hunting men long enough to anticipate their likely moves. "Where can we go?" Ruth asked, adjusting her grip on the carbine with hands that showed only the slightest tremor, despite everything they'd just experienced. "The whole town's underwater, except for the high ground, and that's where they'll expect us to head." "Clegg's mine," Boone said grimly, the words tasting bitter in his mouth like medicine that might cure or kill depending on the dosage. "The tailings hill is above the flood line, and there might be shelter in the processing buildings." Dakota knew the place well. An artificial mountain of crushed rock and mercury amalgamation tailings runoff, where Horace Clegg's silver extraction operation had been poisoning the land for 5 years running. The mine owner was a grasping tyrant who'd grown wealthy by exploiting both his workers and the earth itself. But his hilltop compound offered the only dry ground for miles around. As they began the arduous climb toward the mining operation, picking their way carefully through terrain made treacherous by rain and loose gravel, Sylvia spoke from her stretcher with a voice that was still weak, but gaining strength as the laudanum began to wear off and consciousness reasserted its hold. "I need to tell you something about Clegg." She said, her words carrying the weight of secrets that had been carried too long in silence. "I don't just sew dresses for the townspeople and mend work clothes for miners." She paused, gathering her thoughts, like a woman preparing to make a confession that might damn her soul, or finally free it from the burden of complicity. "I've been treating his injured workers in secret, the ones hurt in cave-ins and equipment failures that never get reported to the territorial authorities. Men with crushed hands, broken backs, lungs full of rock dust from breathing poison air day after day." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, as if speaking the truth aloud gave her access to reserves of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "Clegg pays me to keep quiet about the accidents, to patch up his workers without asking questions or keeping records that might interest U.S. deputy marshals and the territorial judge's clerk. Blood money." Ruth said with the moral clarity that had made her an effective teacher and a thorn in the side of parents who thought ignorance was preferable to uncomfortable knowledge. "Survival money." Sylvia corrected her voice, carrying the weight of hard choices made in desperate circumstances where idealism was a luxury few could afford. "A woman alone doesn't have many options in this territory. But I've been keeping my own records anyway." She patted the pocket of her torn dress with trembling fingers. "Names, dates, injuries, payments. Evidence of what really happens in those mines when nobody with authority is watching." Dr. Boone stopped pushing the stretcher for a moment, understanding the implications immediately with the clarity that came from years of treating the consequences of other men's greed. "You realize what that means if Clegg thinks you might expose his operations to federal authorities. He'll kill me to keep his secrets buried alongside his workers." Sylvia finished quietly her words, carrying no trace of self-pity, but complete acceptance of the danger she'd placed herself in by choosing conscience over safety. "Yes, I know. I've known for months that it would come to this eventually." They reached the base of the tailings hill as the first shots rang out behind them, echoing off the rocky slopes like thunder trapped in a canyon. Clegg's private guards, hard men with short rifles and permanent scowls etched into their weathered faces by years of enforcing their employer's will, were already moving down the slope to intercept them. These weren't bounty hunters motivated by reward money and the promise of easy pickings. They were company men whose job was to protect their employer's interests at any cost, men who'd signed contracts that bound them to Clegg's service, with bonds stronger than law or conscience. Take cover behind those ore cars. Dakota ordered, pulling Sylvia's stretcher behind the rusted mining equipment that dotted the hillside like mechanical grave markers left by an industrial civilization that had moved on to rape other landscapes. The rail cars provided decent protection from rifle fire, but they were trapped on open ground with enemies above and below, like insects caught between the jaws of closing pliers. Thinking quickly, Dakota rigged a simple but effective trap, using rope from his saddle and a broken pick handle that had been discarded by some long-forgotten miner whose dreams had died in these poisoned hills. When the lead guard's horse reached the trigger point, the improvised snare sent both rider and mount tumbling in a cascade of loose gravel and Spanish curses that would have made a priest blush. Ruth followed up with carefully aimed shots that sent the other guards scrambling for cover, her Spencer carbine barking defiance at the storm-dark sky. "You fight like you were born to it," Sylvia observed as Dakota returned to her side, checking her bandages with quick, efficient movements that spoke of experience gained through necessity rather than formal training. "Wars make warriors of everyone," he replied, his hands gentle despite their size and the calluses that spoke of years handling weapons designed to end life rather than preserve it. Apache, Mexican, American. It doesn't matter in the end. Survival is survival, no matter what flag you serve or what god you pray to. The rough handling during their escape had started the stump bleeding again, but not dangerously, more of a seepage that spoke of stressed tissue rather than arterial damage. More concerning was the fever that had begun building in her slender frame, turning her skin hot to the touch despite the cool rain that continued falling like tears from an indifferent sky. "How do you feel?" he asked, his dark eyes searching her face for signs of shock or infection that might signal the beginning of the end despite all their efforts. "Like I lost a leg, but gained something else," she said softly, her gaze holding his, with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "You move like you're counting heartbeats, measuring time in ways that matter. Counting means you're still alive," he answered, and something in his voice made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with blood loss or pain. "Every heartbeat is a victory against forces that want to drag us down into darkness." The moment was shattered by renewed gunfire from below, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns, as Stroud's bounty hunters regrouped and began advancing up the hill with the methodical precision of men who'd done this kind of work many times before. Caught between two hostile forces that were slowly tightening their noose, Dakota realized they needed a new strategy that didn't rely on firepower they didn't possess or defensive positions they couldn't maintain. "The railroad grade," he said, pointing toward the tracks that curved around the base of the hill, like a steel serpent following the contours of the land. "If we can reach the rails, we can follow them out of the valley, to places where horses can't follow and men on foot become vulnerable." It was a desperate gamble. The tracks were exposed and offered little cover from the riflemen positioned above them. But it was better than being trapped on the hillside between hammer and anvil, waiting for ammunition to run out and choices to disappear entirely. They loaded Sylvia onto a mining cart, its wheels protesting with squeals that spoke of neglect and abuse, and began the treacherous descent through sheets of rain that turned the world into a gray watercolor painting, where distances became deceptive and solid ground proved illusory. Bullets sang through the air around them as both groups of enemies converged on their position, and the sound of lead striking stone adding its own percussion to the storm's symphony. At the bottom of the hill, salvation appeared in an unexpected form that spoke of human decency surviving even in the midst of chaos and violence. Ned Halper and his 16-year-old son were working frantically to get a railroad handcar moving despite the flooded tracks and treacherous footing that made every step a negotiation with disaster. The farmer looked up as they approached, taking in their desperate situation, with eyes that had learned to read trouble from long experience with weather creditors and the 1,000 small tragedies that plagued those who tried to scratch a living from unforgiving land. "Climb aboard," he shouted over the noise of wind and gunfire that seemed to come from all directions at once. "We'll pump you clear of this whole mess, by golly." The handcar was designed for track maintenance rather than passenger service, but it represented their only chance of escape from the closing trap that threatened to crush them all. Sylvia lay across grain sacks that smelled of wheat and honest labor, while the others took turns working the pump handle that propelled them along the rain-slick rails. Dakota crouched protectively over her in the cramped space, his shoulders pressing against hers in an intimacy born of necessity, but charged with growing awareness that transcended the immediate danger they faced. Every bump and jolt of the handcar sent small shocks through both their bodies, and he found himself hyper-aware of her breathing, her warmth, the way she unconsciously leaned into his strength. Behind them, Stroud's men fired from horseback, their bullets pinging off the rails and sending sparks flying like angry fireflies dancing in the rain. One shot grazed the pump handle, sending splinters flying and wounding Ned's son in the hand. Blood welled between the boy's fingers, but Dakota was already there, pressing a clean cloth against the injury with practiced skill. "Keep pressure on it, son," he instructed the frightened youth, his voice calm and reassuring despite the chaos surrounding them. "You'll live to see many more dawns, I promise you that." This is just another storm to weather. As they entered a railroad tunnel timbered with rough-cut pine wedges, creaking under pressure that promised temporary safety from both pursuit and the driving rain that had soaked them all to the bone, Sylvia gripped Dakota's wrist with fingers that had regained some of their strength through sheer force of will. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails that carried them deeper into temporary safety. "You could have escaped alone hours ago, been halfway to Mexico by now." Dakota met her gaze in the flickering lantern light, seeing intelligence and courage shining in eyes that held no trace of self-pity, despite everything she'd endured. The question deserved an honest answer, even if the truth revealed more about his own wounds than he was comfortable sharing. "Because," he said carefully, choosing his words like a man selecting arrows for a crucial shot, "some choices define who you are in ways that can't be undone. And some deaths change who you become, whether you want them to or not." The tunnel offered blessed respite from the storm and their pursuers, but everyone knew it couldn't last long. Stroud would find another route around the obstacle, and Clegg's men controlled most of the territory ahead. They were still trapped between opposing forces, with a wounded woman who couldn't run, and secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. In the dancing shadows cast by their lantern, Dr. Boone examined Sylvia's medical supplies, more carefully searching for anything that might help with pain management or infection prevention. His weathered fingers found something unexpected tucked into the lining of her surgical roll, a small ledger book, its pages stained with old blood and filled with cramped handwriting that spoke of long nights and careful record-keeping. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the ledger with curiosity and growing concern that showed in the lines around his eyes. Sylvia's face went pale as winter snow, and for a moment she seemed to stop breathing entirely. "My private records," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of months of dangerous secrets that had been eating away at her conscience like acid. "Names and dates of every miner I've treated. Proof of Clegg's cover-ups and the blood money he pays to keep his workers silent about accidents that should be reported to federal authorities." Dakota took the ledger from Boone's hands, scanning the entries by the uncertain light of their lantern. Most of the names meant nothing to him. White men's names that blended together like faces in a crowd of strangers. but one entry near the middle of the book made his blood run cold as mountain water in winter, freezing his heart in his chest. Written in Sylvia's careful script, the words seemed to leap off the page like brands burned into his soul. Nantan Apache Youth Canyon wound. Delivered by Stroud for bounty collection. Demanded immediate amputation as proof of capture. Refused treatment as requested. Youth escaped during night watch. Attached to the page with a drop of dried wax was a small bead from a bracelet turquoise and silver with an uneven drill hole that Dakota recognized with the clarity of lightning-striking stone. He had made that bead himself as a boy, drilling the hole with a bone awl because he hadn't yet learned the patience needed to make them perfectly round. It was part of a bracelet he'd given to Nantan on his 16th birthday, just days before the raid that had led to his brother's capture and eventual death. "This is my brother," he said, his voice so quiet that the others had to lean close to hear him above the tunnel's echoing acoustics. Nantan died from this wound, but even as he spoke, his eyes were scanning the rest of the entry, reading details that began to paint a very different picture from the one he'd carried in his heart for 15 years. Sylvia had refused Stroud's demand for immediate amputation. She'd argued that the wound could be treated, that the leg could be saved with proper care and time to heal. Sylvia studied his face in the lantern light, reading the grief etched there like script carved in stone by years of self-recrimination. "I remember him," she said softly, her words carrying across the years to that terrible night when a young Apache warrior had been brought to her, more dead than alive. Young, maybe 16 summers. Beautiful eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. She paused, gathering her thoughts, like a woman preparing to relive a nightmare that had haunted her dreams. Stroud brought him to me after some kind of skirmish in Dead Horse Canyon. The leg wound was severe, but not beyond hope if properly treated with time and care. Her voice grew stronger with the memory of her defiance, even as tears began to track down her cheeks. When I told Stroud the leg could be saved, that amputation wasn't necessary, he became violent. He said he needed proof of capture for the Territorial Bounty Office, that a live Apache was worth less than a crippled one who couldn't fight again. Dakota's grip tightened on the ledger until his knuckles showed white against his copper skin. "But you refused to cut." I told him healing came first, that I wouldn't mutilate a patient to satisfy his bounty requirements. She confirmed, her voice growing stronger with the memory of her moral courage. That night, I slipped the boy a knife to cut his bonds. I helped him escape through the back window, gave him directions to avoid the main trails. She touched the turquoise bead with gentle fingers that trembled with emotion. "He left this behind, along with a message in Apache script that I never learned to read. I kept it because it seemed important somehow, like a promise or a prayer." Dakota closed his eyes, remembering those final terrible days when Nantan had struggled home with a festering wound, delirious with fever, and speaking in fragments about a white woman who tried to help him. In his guilt and rage, Dakota had dismissed his brother's rambling words as fever dreams too, consumed with self-blame, to listen carefully to what Nantan was trying to tell him about unexpected kindness in a world gone mad. The revelation struck him like a physical blow that drove the breath from his lungs and left him reeling. This changed everything, not just about Sylvia, but about the guilt he'd carried for 15 years, like a stone in his chest. Stroud hadn't simply been hunting Apache warriors for bounty money. He'd been systematically capturing them for men like Clegg, who used their suffering as leverage in some darker trade that profited from human misery. And Sylvia hadn't been complicit in his brother's death. She'd risked her own safety to help him escape from a fate that might have been worse than death itself. Looking at the Apache words scrawled beneath a crude sketch of a horse, Dakota whispered the translation that had taken him 15 years to understand. "She gives blade. She saves. Tell my brother the white woman has a good heart." Nantan had been trying to tell him about the white woman who'd shown him kindness in the face of cruelty, who'd chosen healing over profit, even when it meant defying a dangerous man with blood on his hands. His brother had died, not because Dakota hesitated too long to amputate, but because Stroud's brutality had turned a treatable wound into a death sentence through deliberate neglect and abuse. The guilt he'd carried for 15 years, the certainty that his indecision had killed his brother, suddenly became something more complex and far more dangerous. The vow Dakota had sworn over Nantan's grave now had new targets, not just the specter of his own hesitation, but the living men who'd perverted healing into an instrument of oppression and profit. Rage surged through him like wildfire through dry grass, hot and consuming and demanding immediate action. He started toward the tunnel mouth, ready to hunt down Stroud and settle accounts with knife and gun to paint the rain-soaked earth with the blood of men who'd profited from his brother's suffering, and countless others besides. But Sylvia's hand on his arm stopped him, as surely as if she'd wrapped an iron chain around his chest. "Don't," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too much death to romanticize vengeance or mistake revenge for justice. "If you go after them now, in rage, instead of planning, you'll die, and Nantan's sacrifice will mean nothing." He escaped because he wanted to live, not because he wanted his brother to throw away his life for the satisfaction of killing his tormentors. The wisdom in her words cut through his fury like cold water thrown on flames, shocking him back to rationality. She was right. Charging into battle now would only add his corpse to his brother's, leaving no one to expose the truth about Clegg's operations or ensure that Stroud faced justice for his crimes against the innocent. "We finish this together," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of an oath, newly sworn and tempered in the fire of revelation. "The way it should have been finished 15 years ago, when my brother first tried to tell me the truth." Outside the tunnel, the storm was building toward its climax, with the fury of ancient gods awakening to judge the sins of mortals. Lightning split the sky like the world's own artillery, and thunder rolled through the canyons with the sound of mountains falling and civilizations crumbling. The railroad timbers groaned under the assault of wind and water that seemed determined to wash away every trace of human ambition. And suddenly, the tunnel itself began to shake as the flood undermined foundations that had seemed solid as bedrock when they'd sought shelter here. "The whole grade's giving way," Ned shouted over the growing cacophony that filled the air like the screams of dying demons. "We need to get out of here before the roof comes down on our heads and buries us alive." They pushed the handcar toward the tunnel's far end as rocks began falling from the ceiling like deadly rain that promised to crush anyone too slow to escape. The exit led to a timber bridge over what had once been Ghost Hollow Creek, but now resembled a raging torrent that could swallow houses whole and still hunger for more. As they emerged from the tunnel's relative safety into the storm's full fury, they found that Clegg's men had beaten them to the bridge with the efficiency of professional killers who understood the value of controlling strategic positions. The mine owner himself stood on the far side with a squad of armed guards, while behind them Stroud's bounty hunters closed in through the rain like wolves scenting wounded prey. Horace Clegg cut an imposing figure even in the storm's fury, standing like a general surveying a battlefield where victory seemed assured. At 55, he'd built an empire on other people's suffering, transforming himself from a failed prospector into a silver baron, whose wealth rivaled that of Eastern industrialists who'd never seen the sun rise over desert mountains or felt the bite of alkali dust in their throats. But money hadn't made him soft. It had simply given him better weapons to enforce his will, and more sophisticated methods of crushing those who opposed his vision of progress. He stood under an oilskin coat, like a biblical patriarch pronouncing judgment, flanked by men carrying powder kegs and rifles, master of all he could see. and much that lay beyond the horizon. "Turn back!" he called across the bridge, his voice somehow carrying over the storm's roar with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The woman belongs to me by right of contract and common law, and the bounty man can have his Apache scalp. No one else needs to die today if you're reasonable about this situation." It was the kind of pragmatic offer that had built Clegg's fortune. Everyone gets something they want, and the cost is paid by those too weak to demand a better bargain. But the days when such arrangements could be made in the shadows were ending, and the light of justice was beginning to shine in places where darkness had reigned too long. "If I go back, the ledger disappears forever." Sylvia called back, her voice steady despite the weakness that made every word an effort that cost her dearly, along with everyone who knows what's written in it, and everyone who might testify to what they've seen. The truth of her words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. And everyone present understood that Clegg's mercy would extend only as far as his ability to silence witnesses permanently. His definition of a reasonable agreement was usually spelled in lead and measured in graves that would never be found by those who might ask uncomfortable questions. With the storm's fury reaching its peak and their immediate escape route blocked by armed men who showed no inclination toward mercy or negotiation, Clegg made his next move with the predictability of sunrise. He retreated to his mining compound, intending to destroy the evidence of his crimes, and collapse the mine shafts on anyone foolish enough to follow him into what would become their tomb. The silver works sat atop the tailings hill, like a fortress built from greed and human suffering, surrounded by the poisoned wasteland that was the true legacy of industrial extraction applied without regard for environmental consequences or human cost. As they approached the mine entrance through sheets of rain that reduced visibility to mere yards, and turned every step into a negotiation. With treacherous footing, they found their path blocked by figures emerging from the smoke and mist, like ghosts given physical form. But these weren't Clegg's usual guards. Instead, they faced a mob of miners' men whose faces were blackened with soot, and whose eyes held the desperate fury of workers who'd been told that their jobs, their families' survival, depended on stopping the troublemakers who'd come to destroy their livelihood. "That's far enough," called a voice from the crowd, thick with a Mexican accent that spoke of long years working in conditions no man should have to endure. "Senor Clegg says you've come to blow up the mine to steal our silver and leave our children to starve." Dakota recognized the speaker, Mateo Cruz, a man in his 30s, who'd hired on with Clegg for the promise of steady wages in a territory where regular employment was often the difference between survival and slow death. His dark eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned that life offered few choices, and most of them were bad, but who'd chosen to trust in the devil he knew rather than the angels he didn't. "Clegg's lying to you," Dakota said, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm's noise. "We're not here to steal anything or destroy your jobs. We're here to expose the truth about what happens to workers who get hurt, about the men who disappear when they ask questions about safety." But Stroud had been clever in his manipulation, playing on fears that ran deeper than logic or evidence. The miners had been told that outsiders were coming to shut down their operation, to leave them unemployed in a territory where unemployment meant death for their families. It was a lie, but it was a believable lie that spoke to their deepest fears. "You expect us to believe in Apache and a bunch of troublemakers over the man who pays our wages," Mateo replied, though doubt was beginning to creep into his voice as he looked at Sylvia's obvious injuries and the exhausted faces of people who looked more like refugees than raiders. "I expect you to believe the evidence," Sylvia said, her voice carrying despite her weakness. She held up the blood-stained ledger with trembling hands. "This book contains the names of your friends and neighbors' men who were hurt in accidents that Clegg covered up. Men who died because they didn't get proper medical treatment, because admitting they were injured would have meant admitting the mine wasn't safe. The crowd began to murmur as she spoke, and Dakota could see recognition dawning in several faces. These men knew who'd been hurt, who disappeared, who died under mysterious circumstances that were never properly investigated. They'd been told to keep quiet, to mind their own business, but they remembered. "Show them," Ruth said quietly. "Read the names." Sylvia opened the ledger, despite the rain that threatened to wash away the ink, and began reading in a voice that grew stronger with each name. Diego Morales crushed, hand in cave-in, March 15th. Paid $20 to claim he was hurt at home. William Chen lung sickness from bad air, April 2nd. Family paid $50 after he died, told to say it was pneumonia. Jose Santos back broken by falling timber, June 10th. Still alive, but can't work. Family paid $30 a month to stay quiet. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. These weren't nameless statistics, as they were friends, relatives, neighbors, whose suffering had been used as currency in Clegg's empire of silence. Faces that had been hardened by years of difficult labor began to show cracks of doubt and growing anger. That's my cousin Diego." One miner whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He told us he fell off his horse, but I always wondered. His hand was crushed too bad for that kind of accident. Jose Santos is my compadre." Another added, his anger building with each word. "His back was broken by falling timber, just like she said. Clegg told us it was an accident at home, that Jose was careless with his own work. The tide was turning, but slowly, and Dakota could see Stroud positioning himself for a clear shot, while the miners were distracted by revelations that challenged everything they'd been told to believe. The bounty hunter's face showed no trace of concern about the growing unrest. He'd seen crowds turn before, and he knew that a few well-placed bullets could scatter even the angriest mob. "It's all lies." Clegg's voice boomed from the mine entrance, where he stood flanked by his personal guards. "These people are criminals and troublemakers who want to destroy everything we've built here. They're trying to turn you against me with forged documents and made-up stories." But his words rang hollow now that the truth was beginning to spread through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. The miners had seen too much lost, too many friends buried, too many dreams to be easily fooled by the same lies that had worked for so long. "If it's all lies," Mateo said, his voice growing harder with each word, "then why are you so eager to bury the evidence? Why not let the territorial authorities examine the ledger and prove it's false?" Clegg's face flushed with rage and something that might have been fear. "Because I don't have to prove anything to anyone. This is my mine, my property, and I decide what happens here." It was the wrong thing to say to men who'd been told they were partners in a great enterprise whose labor had built the wealth that Clegg now claimed as his own exclusive property. The crowd's murmur grew to a roar, no longer the sound of confusion, but of awakening anger that had been suppressed too long. Taking advantage of the chaos, Dakota began moving toward the mine entrance, where Sylvia's medical knowledge might be needed to treat whatever injuries were about to occur. But as he reached the tunnel mouth, he found himself face to face with Stroud, who'd used the crowd's distraction to position himself for the confrontation he'd been seeking since the chase began. End of the line. Apache. Stroud set his rifle trained on Dakota's chest with rock-steady aim. "You've caused me more trouble than any single bounty was worth, but it's time to settle accounts." The mine tunnel stretched before them, like the throat of some ancient beast lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on walls slick with moisture and decades of accumulated poison. The air was thick with more than humidity. It carried the weight of suppressed secrets, spilled blood, and the kind of corruption that festered in dark places where no one with authority bothered to look. Dakota moved deeper into the passage, drawing Stroud away from the crowd of miners who were beginning to turn on Clegg's remaining guards. Behind them, he could hear Mateo's voice rising above the others, no longer questioning but commanding. "Miguel, you and Pedro get those powder kegs away from Clegg's men. Santos, round up the injured workers. They need to hear this woman read their names from that book." The revolution had begun, but Dakota's attention was focused entirely on the man tracking him through the poisoned heart of the mountain. Stroud moved with the patience of a predator who'd learned that haste killed more hunters than their prey, ever did, his rifle never wavering, despite the treacherous footing and uncertain light. "You know what's funny about your brother?" Stroud called out, his voice echoing off stone walls that had heard too much suffering already. Boy thought that French seamstress was going to save his worthless hide. Kept babbling about her even after I brought him back to collect what Clegg owed me for a live capture. Dakota forced himself to keep moving, to not respond to the bait that Stroud was dangling like a worm on a hook. But the bounty hunter wasn't finished with his cruelty. See, Clegg had this arrangement with the territorial government. Apache prisoners were worth more if they were damaged. Showed they'd been properly subdued, you understand. That boy's leg was healing clean when I brought him in the second time. Had to break it again proper this time before we delivered him to the army post. The words hit Dakota like physical blows, each revelation more terrible than the last. Stroud had captured Nantan twice, once when Sylvia had helped him escape, and again when the young warrior was trying to make his way home through territory crawling with bounty hunters and cavalry patrols. Of course, things went wrong with the second breaking. Stroud continued his voice, carrying the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Bone got infected, started to rot. But that was fine. Dead Apache was still worth the bounty money, and nobody asked too many questions about how they died. Rage flared in Dakota's chest like fire in dry grass, but he forced it down. Stroud wanted him angry, wanted him to make mistakes driven by emotion rather than tactical thinking. The tunnel ahead curved sharply to the left, and Dakota could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, a sound that spoke of structural weakness in the mountain's poisoned heart. Nothing to say. Apache, your brother, had plenty to say right up until the end. Kept talking about that white woman, about how she was going to expose Clegg's operation and get justice for all the workers who'd been hurt. Real touching, actually, the way he believed in fairy tales, right up until he stopped breathing. The curve in the tunnel provided the opportunity Dakota had been waiting for. As Stroud rounded the bend, confident in his superior firepower and position, Dakota was already moving. The war club he'd carved from desert ironwood caught the bounty hunter across the wrist with crushing force, sending the rifle spinning into the darkness with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo forever. But Stroud was quicker than his age suggested, rolling with the impact and drawing one of his matched revolvers with the fluid grace of someone who'd survived dozens of similar encounters. The muzzle flash lit up the tunnel like lightning, and Dakota felt the bullet crease his ribs as he dove behind a wooden support beam that groaned under the mountain's weight. "That the best you got, boy?" Stroud snarled, working his way closer with his weapon trained on the beam that provided Dakota's only cover. "Your brother put up more fight than this, and he was half dead when I caught him the second time." Menacurhau, from somewhere deeper in the mine, came the sound of shouting voices and gunfire. The miners' rebellion was spreading through the compound, like wildfire, consuming everything Clegg had built through years of exploitation and silence. But down here in the depths, it was just two men and 15 years of accumulated hatred given physical form. Dakota's hand found a loose chunk of ore, silver-veined quartz, that caught the torchlight like crystallized starlight. He hurled it at the nearest torch, plunging half the tunnel into darkness, just as Stroud fired again. The bullet sparked off stone where Dakota had been crouching, but he was already moving, using the darkness to close the distance between them. They collided in a tangle of limbs and murderous intent, both men fighting with the desperation of those who understood that only one would leave this tunnel alive. Stroud was heavier and had years of experience in this kind of close-quarters combat, but Dakota had been shaped by Apache training that taught warriors to use their environment as a weapon. The bounty hunter's second revolver came up, but Dakota caught his wrist and slammed it against the tunnel wall until fingers opened and the gun tumbled away into the shadows. They rolled across the uneven floor, trading blows that echoed off stone like hammer strikes on an anvil, each man seeking the leverage that would let him end this once and for all. "You want to know the real truth about your brother?" Stroud gasped as they struggled, his words coming in short bursts between attempts to gain the upper hand. He could have lived. That infection was treatable if we'd gotten him to a real doctor instead of that bleeding heart seamstress. But Clegg needed him dead, needed another Apache scalp to show the territorial government how effective his operation was. The revelation hit Dakota like cold water, shocking him back to clarity. Nantan hadn't died from delayed treatment, or Dakota's hesitation. He'd been murdered as deliberately as if Stroud had put a bullet in his brain. The guilt that had driven 15 years of self-recrimination transformed into something cleaner and more focused, the need for justice rather than mere revenge. But the moment of understanding cost him his advantage. Stroud's knee caught him in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and allowing the bounty hunter to break free. Both men scrambled for weapons in the flickering light, Stroud reaching for a mining pick that had been left against the tunnel wall. Dakota drawing his obsidian knife with its edge still slick with desert toxin. They circled each other like wolves, each looking for an opening that wouldn't leave them vulnerable to a counterattack. The pick gave Stroud greater reach, but the confined space of the tunnel worked against the weapon's length. The knife was deadlier in close quarters, but Dakota would have to get past that iron point to use it effectively. "That poison on your blade won't help you," Stroud observed, noting the dark stain on the obsidian edge. "I've built up immunity to most of the toxins used in this territory. Occupational hazard when you're hunting Indians who like their blade work." He lunged forward with the pick, its point aimed at Dakota's heart, with the precision of someone who'd used similar weapons many times before. But instead of dodging, Dakota stepped inside the arc of the strike, accepting a shallow cut across his shoulder in exchange for getting close enough to use his knife. The obsidian blade sliced across Stroud's forearm, opening a wound that bled freely, but wasn't immediately incapacitating. More importantly, it delivered the desert toxin into his bloodstream, assuming the bounty hunter had been lying about his immunity to prove himself seemed more dangerous than he was. They broke apart again, both men bleeding now, both beginning to feel the effects of exertion in air that was too thin and too poisoned for extended combat. But Stroud's movements were already showing the slight tremor that spoke of toxin beginning to work its way through his system, and his breathing was becoming more labored with each passing moment. "Clever," he admitted, though his voice remained steady despite the growing weakness in his limbs. "But it'll take more than plant poison to put me down. I've got enough strength left to finish what I started with your family." The words were meant to provoke another rage-driven attack, but Dakota had learned the cost of fighting with emotion rather than discipline. Instead, he began working his way around the tunnel's perimeter, using the shadows and uneven walls to limit Stroud's ability to predict his movements. From somewhere above them came the sound of splintering timber and falling rock as the mine's structure was beginning to fail under the assault of flood and fire. They didn't have much time before the mountain reclaimed what had been stolen from its depths, burying both men beneath tons of stone and poisoned earth. Getting scared, Apache. Stroud taunted, though his own movements were becoming increasingly unsteady as the toxins spread through his bloodstream. "Afraid you'll die down here with me instead of getting back to your seamstress. She's probably dead already. Clegg doesn't leave loose ends untied." The mention of Sylvia sent ice through Dakota's veins, but not the kind of cold that paralyzed. This was the focused chill of a predator preparing to strike the clarity that came when all distractions fell away, and only the essential remained. If Stroud was right, if Clegg had already silenced the woman who tried to save his brother, then justice demanded payment in blood. But as he prepared to close the distance for the final time, a familiar voice echoed down the tunnel from somewhere behind him. "Dakota, the mountain's coming down. We need to get out of here now." Sylvia's voice strained with effort, but unmistakably alive. She'd somehow made her way into the mine, despite her injuries, despite the chaos raging above ground. The knowledge that she was still breathing gave him strength, but it also created a new urgency. If the tunnels were collapsing, they needed to reach safety quickly. Stroud heard the voice too, and his pale eyes lit up with malicious understanding. "Sounds like she's still kicking after all. But not for long. This whole place is going to come down on our heads, and I'd rather die than let you walk out of here alive." He raised the mining pick one final time, putting all his remaining strength into an overhead strike that would have split Dakota's skull if it had connected. But the toxin had slowed his reflexes just enough, and 15 years of Apache training had taught Dakota to read an opponent's intentions in the set of their shoulders and the angle of their stance. He sidestepped the blow and drove his obsidian knife up under Stroud's ribs, angling the blade toward the heart with the precision his grandfather had taught him during long-ago hunting lessons. The bounty hunter's eyes went wide with surprise and something that might have been fear, his weapon clattering to the tunnel floor as he stumbled backward against the stone wall. "Tell me why," Dakota said quietly, his knife still buried in Stroud's chest, but not yet delivering the final thrust that would end this. "Tell me why my brother had to die for your profit." Stroud coughed, blood speckling his lips as the toxin and the blade wound combined to shut down his body's vital systems. Because men like him don't matter in the grand scheme of things. Territory's got to be civilized, got to be made safe for progress. Sometimes that means sacrifices. My brother was 16 years old. Dakota replied, his voice carrying 15 years of grief and guilt that was finally being transformed into something approaching peace. He dreamed of hunting elk in winter and raising horses in summer. He mattered. Maybe. Stroud whispered, his voice growing fainter as life ebbed away, like water draining from a broken vessel. But dreams don't pay bounties, and bounties don't care about boys who dream. The words ended in a rattling breath that seemed to echo through the tunnel long after silence returned. Dakota withdrew his knife and cleaned the blade on Stroud's coat, and then began making his way back toward the tunnel entrance where Sylvia's voice had come from. Behind him, the sound of falling rock grew louder as the mountain prepared to reclaim what had been stolen from its depths. He found her near the main shaft, supported by Mateo Cruz, and looking pale but determined despite everything she'd endured. Around them, the miners who'd turned against Clegg were helping to evacuate the wounded and gather evidence of the mine owner's crimes. But the mountain itself was becoming their enemy now, with timbers snapping under impossible weight and rockfalls blocking passages that had been carved through decades of dangerous labor. "The whole place is coming down," Mateo reported grimly, his face streaked with soot and blood from the fighting above. Clegg tried to blow the main supports when he saw his men turning against him. Crazy Bastardo thought he could bury the evidence along with everyone who might testify against him. "Where is he now?" Dakota asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the look of grim satisfaction on the miners' faces. "Trapped in the silver vault." Sylvia replied, her voice carrying a mixture of justice and sorrow that spoke to the complexity of human nature. When the explosion started, he ran back to save his precious metal instead of getting to safety. The roof came down and sealed him in with all the wealth he valued more than human life. It was a fitting end for a man who'd spent years measuring human suffering in dollars and cents, who'd built his empire on the principle that some lives were worth less than others. But Dakota felt no satisfaction in Clegg's fate, only a weary sense that another cycle of violence had finally ended. The evacuation from the collapsing mine was a race against time and geology, with every step potentially their last. As the mountain shrugged off the wounds that had been inflicted over decades of exploitation, they moved through passages that groaned and shifted around them, past chambers where the air itself seemed poisoned by years of chemical extraction. At one point, a massive timber gave way directly above their group, and only Mateo's quick reflexes saved them from being crushed beneath tons of wood and stone. The Mexican miner threw himself against the falling beam, his back taking the impact that would have killed Sylvia outright. The sound of his spine snapping was audible even over the mountain's death throes, but he managed to hold the timber long enough for others to pull the wounded woman to safety. "Go!" He gasped, blood frothing at his lips as internal injuries began to claim his strength. "My family. Tell them I chose the right side when it mattered." Dakota wanted to stay to try to carry the injured man to safety, despite the impossibility of the task. But Mateo shook his head, with the finality of someone who understood that his sacrifice was buying precious seconds for others to escape. "Your brother?" "Nantan." He whispered, his voice growing fainter with each word. "He would be proud of what you did here today. Go with God, mi amigo." They left him there in the darkness, holding up the mountain's weight with his broken body, so that others might live to see another sunrise. It would be remembered as one of the many acts of heroism that transformed a mine disaster into something approaching triumph over the forces of greed and exploitation. The final dash to daylight was a blur of falling rock and desperate movement, with the tunnel collapsing behind them, like the earth itself was erasing the evidence of what had been done in its depths. They emerged into gray afternoon light, just as the mountain gave a final shudder and settled into silence, sealing forever the silver veins that had cost so many lives to exploit. The storm had passed while they were underground, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a sun that seemed brighter than it had in years. The mining camp was in chaos, but it was the ordered chaos of people working together to help the injured rather than the violent discord of men fighting for their lives. Ruth Calder had established a makeshift medical station in the schoolhouse, using her organizational skills to coordinate the treatment of wounded miners and the documentation of evidence that would ensure justice was served. Dr. Boone moved between patients with the calm efficiency of a man who'd spent his life saving lives, rather than taking them his hands steady despite the magnitude of the disaster they were dealing with. As news of the mine's collapse spread through the territory, riders began arriving from surrounding towns, territorial marshals, federal investigators, and newspapermen who sensed a story that would capture the nation's attention. The age of industrial exploitation, carried out in shadow and silence, was ending, replaced by an era where such crimes would be exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Marshal Tom Morrison, a grizzled veteran of 20 years spent bringing law to lawless places, surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally seen justice catch up with men who'd thought themselves above its reach. "Biggest case I've handled in 2 decades," he admitted to Dakota as they watched the last of the survivors being brought up from the valley. "Federal government's been looking for evidence of this kind of labor exploitation for years. That ledger your friend kept is going to put a lot of people in prison who thought they were untouchable." The trials that followed would indeed reshape the territory's understanding of workers' rights and corporate responsibility. Stroud's confession, corroborated by Sylvia's meticulously kept records, exposed a network of corruption that reached from local mine owners to territorial officials who'd been paid to look the other way when inconvenient questions were asked. But for Dakota and Sylvia, the immediate future was about healing wounds, both physical and spiritual, that had been carried too long in silence. The makeshift hospital in Ruth's schoolhouse became their world for the next several weeks, a place where the careful work of recovery could begin under the watchful eyes of people who'd learned the true value of human life. Dr. Boone crafted a more sophisticated prosthetic leg for Sylvia from materials salvaged from the mining equipment, demonstrating the kind of ingenuity that had made frontier medicine an art as much as a science. The device was crude compared to what Eastern cities might offer, but it was functional and allowed her to walk with dignity, despite her loss. "You'll need to adjust the straps twice each day," he instructed Dakota, showing him the proper technique with hands that had forgotten more about healing than most doctors ever learned. "Watch for signs of chafing or infection, and don't let her push herself too hard in the early days." Dakota's hands proved surprisingly gentle as he learned the routine of caring for someone whose body had been forever changed by violence. This was different from battlefield medicine. This was about adaptation and hope, about building something new from what remained after destruction had done its worst. During the long evenings when the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they would sit together on the schoolhouse steps and talk about the future they might build together. Not the passionate romance of storybooks, but something deeper and more durable. A partnership forged in crisis and tempered by mutual respect. "I've been thinking about rebuilding my practice," Sylvia said one evening as they watched the first stars appear in a sky finally free of storm clouds. "Not just as a seamstress, but as a healer. The territory needs people who understand that medicine is about serving those who need help, not those who can pay the most." The Apache have a saying. Dakota replied, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years spent learning hard lessons about guilt and redemption. "The best way to honor the dead is to help the living. I think my brother would approve of what we're trying to build here." As autumn turned to winter, and the wounded land began to heal from the scars left by industrial exploitation, they made their plans with the careful deliberation of people who'd learned not to waste second chances. The schoolhouse that had sheltered them during the crisis would become a clinic where Sylvia's medical knowledge could serve those who needed it most, while Dakota's understanding of the land and its people would help bridge the gap between Apache and Mexican and American communities that had been divided by years of suspicion and violence. Ruth Calder volunteered to help with the administrative side of their practice, bringing her organizational skills and moral authority to bear on the challenge of creating something genuinely new in a territory that had seen too much of the old ways of doing business. Her classroom would continue to educate the next generation. But now, it would also serve as a meeting place where different communities could learn to work together rather than against each other. Dr. Boone, energized by the prospect of training a new generation of healers, agreed to provide formal medical instruction to both Dakota and anyone else who showed aptitude for the healing arts. The frontier needed more people who understood that saving lives was more important than following arbitrary rules about who was allowed to practice medicine. Even Ned Halper, his farm, slowly recovering from the flood damage, found a role in the new order that was emerging from the ashes of the old. His knowledge of engineering and construction proved invaluable in designing buildings that could serve multiple purposes while being accessible to people with various physical limitations. The first anniversary of the flood found Ghost Hollow transformed from a company town where workers lived at the mercy of industrial overlords into a genuine community where people looked out for each other and shared both burdens and benefits more equitably. The mine remained sealed, its poisoned depths serving as a monument to the cost of unchecked greed. But the land around it was beginning to show signs of recovery as nature slowly reclaimed what had been taken. On that anniversary evening, as Dakota and Sylvia walked together through streets that had been rebuilt with hope rather than mere profit in mind, they paused at a small memorial that had been erected to honor those who died in the mine and the flood. Nantan's name was carved in stone, alongside those of Mateo Cruz and the other men who'd given their lives so that others might live free from exploitation. Do you think he would be proud of what we've accomplished? Sylvia asked, her hand resting lightly on Dakota's arm as they read the names of the honored dead. I think he would be amazed that his death led to so much life. Dakota replied, remembering the eager young man who dreamed of hunting elk and raising horses in a world that had seemed intent on crushing such simple hopes. He always believed that good could triumph over evil if people were willing to fight for what was right. As they turned to walk home together, past buildings where lights burned warm and welcoming in windows that spoke of families secure in their futures, the desert wind carried the sound of children's laughter and the distant singing of someone who'd found reason to celebrate the simple fact of being alive. The flood had taken much from Ghost Hollow, but it had also washed away the corruption that had poisoned the community for so long. In its place had grown something stronger and more beautiful than what had been lost, a place where healing was valued over profit, where justice was more important than convenience, and where people of different backgrounds could work together to build something worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. Behind them, the sealed mine stood as a reminder of what happened when greed was allowed to triumph over humanity. But ahead of them, the lights of home promised a future where such tragedies need never be repeated, where the lessons learned in blood and pain would guide generations yet to come toward a better way of living together on the land they all shared. And in that future, the memory of a young Apache warrior named Nantan would live on not as a symbol of injustice, but as proof that even the most senseless deaths could give birth to hope if those left behind had the courage to transform grief into action and vengeance into justice. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but bearing witness to the truth that love and courage could indeed triumph over hatred and greed, given time and the willingness of good people to stand together when it mattered most. The floodwater climbed inch by inch, pressure finding every seam. Cribbing pins rattled as the current tore at the braces.